Okay. Welcome everyone to the CRRC Outdoor Heat Illness Prevention webinar. At any time, if you have questions during this webinar, please email them to veronica@crrcnorth.org. It is also very important that you mute your microphone. Please do so now. We are pleased to welcome David Hornung as our speaker today. David began working for Cal OSHA in 2009 as a compliance officer in Oakland. He spent his first days performing heat inspections for the Outdoor Heat Illness Prevention Standard. He currently serves as the statewide heat program coordinator. He has a BS in mechanical engineering and a master in public health from UC Berkeley. Welcome, David.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me, Veronica and Kathy, and hello to everybody out on the other side of this webinar. So today I'm going to be talking about heat illness prevention, our regulation, and I hope to show how it's applicable to the refuse and recycling workers. Quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. When I spoke to Veronica and Kathy about giving this training, they explained that some on this call will be relative experts on the subject, having already implemented their heat illness prevention programs, while others may be relatively new to learning about heat illness prevention. During this presentation today, I'll cover the basics of heat illness prevention regulation, which is 3395, but I'll also give some real-life examples about the problems you may find when implementing a heat illness prevention program, especially for mobile crews. I'm going to offer up some solutions for these problems. So for those with a lot of experience, I hope you'll be able to consider some of these solutions and consider how you can improve your own program. I'm going to start today's talk by giving a overview of Cal OSHA's role in California. I'm going to talk about the heat illness regulation and how it came to be with a brief history. I'm then going to talk about the regulation itself, and that's going to be the majority of my presentation today. I'm going to then finish with a discussion of some of the difficulties of heat illness in mobile crews. I recognize that mobile crews have unique difficulties in implementing this that fixed establishments and places with indoor locations right next to it don't have. So Cal OSHA has jurisdiction over every place of employment in California. We have both an enforcement side and a consultation side. Now, the enforcement side is your traditional Cal OSHA, what people think about OSHA coming to a work site. We have 26 field offices across the state, and when anyone makes a complaint about unsafe work conditions, or if an accident happens, then a enforcement investigator from a enforcement office would go out there, determine if any violations of our Title VIII regulations occurred, and if so, they would issue citations. That's quite a bit different than our consultation wing. And at the end of today's presentation, I'll provide the contact information for consultation. Consultation does on-site visits where they'll come out at your request to help support you and create your safety regulations. For instance, if you've never ridden a heat illness prevention program, and after looking at the materials on our website, still have some questions about how to implement the program, you could call consultation and invite them out to the work site to have them help you with your program. If at any time, also during a consultation visit, you decide you don't like the person that you're working with, or you're feeling overwhelmed by the process, you can ask them to come back another time, and they will leave your site. So I thought it'd be good to start with a quick history of heat illness in California. And really, heat's been a problem for a long time in California, but it was in 2005 that repeated heat waves began to have a major impact on the workers. It was in 2005 that there were, Cal OSHA investigated 25 heat illnesses where 16 different workers across the state died. And if you remember back to 2005, that was a particularly hot summer. And in 2005, we adopted an emergency regulation for heat illness, which is quite a bit different than our current heat illness regulation. In 2006, there was a permanent regulation, which was adopted. Now, during this time, there was also the death of Marie Vasquez Jimenez, who was a 17-year-old picking grapes. And she died. She was also 2 months pregnant. And it was there that Governor Schwarzenegger got involved. He attended her funeral, and he said, it's inexcusable that those people that pick the fruits and vegetables and do this kind of work, that they shouldn't get the right working conditions. So there's a lot of political will towards having and enforcing the heat illness regulation. There were some changes that happened in 2010. 3395 was amended to add specific provisions during high heat periods, and those are temperatures which are greater than 95 degrees. Today is one of those days. In Sacramento here, it's going to be about 100. And for many of you on this call, I imagine you have workers that are out today in temperatures that are over 95. So as I talk about some of the high heat provisions, think about how you're protecting your workers. And during this period, following the death of Marie Vasquez Jimenez, UFW brought on a lawsuit called the Batista lawsuit, which was, Batista was the fiance of Marie Vasquez Jimenez. And through that lawsuit, there were some additional changes that Cal OSHA made in their enforcement of it. And some of those changes were seen in the 2015 version of the regulation, where we adopted the emergency procedures and acclimatization for how employers need to respond to serious heat-related medical conditions. So now I want to talk a little about the difficulty of a mobile workforce. And I'm going to play an audio clip, which was from AC Transit in a case we had with them. And I think as you think about your workplace, think if you've ever had any of your operators have something similar. Can we turn up the volume on that?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
But then it's going to take the audio from the webinar.
Here, I'm going to do it on here.
So we're having a little bit of technical difficulties for those on the webinar. We're gonna try finding that again and playing it a little later.
It's downloading. So why don't we'll play it in the next round.
Great. So what I hope I'll be able to play for you a little later is an operator of the bus, and what he's saying, I'm so hot, I can hardly think. I just need to get out of this bus right now. And you imagine with a bus full of people, it's a pretty difficult decision to try to leave your passengers. But he's calling into the command center and saying that he's just going to stop the bus and he needs to get out of it. AC Transit, many years ago, decided to buy these Van Hool buses, and there's a picture of them there. And these Van Hools, you'll note, have a lot of glass on them and very small vents. And for whatever reason, they bought hundreds of these buses without any air conditioning. So you'd get temperatures inside these buses that were all glass like a greenhouse, and you'd measure temperatures upwards of 100 degrees with no AC. So you can imagine being inside of one of those. And some people I recognize of your employees may be operating in open air vehicles that don't have air conditioning as well. So think about those workers and how you're going to be protecting them. Similarly, for vehicles that do have AC, what if the AC is broken? What's your expectation of the workers? Are they supposed to go out in those vehicles if the AC is broken, or if the AC breaks during the day, what are they supposed to do? Similarly, for a mobile workforce, you have to think about how they're going to be getting their water. Where are they going to go if they need to use a restroom? Where are they going to go if they need to refill the water that they brought with them during the day? These are the things that I'd like you to think about as we go through the presentation today. So now we're going to talk about the heat illness prevention regulation itself. The regulation is broken down into a number of subsections, which I'm going to cover each one. The first is access to water. Then we're going to talk about shade, the requirement to have some sort of shade structure for employees. We're going to discuss weather monitoring and acclimatization. I'll discuss how many employees, if they get heat illnesses, they get them during the first few days of employment. We're going to talk about high heat procedures. Those are procedures that apply when it's greater than 95 degrees. We're going to cover training, how to train both your employees and your supervisory employees. And lastly, we'll pull it all together in a written procedure that would include your emergency response. Now, if as many employees are watching this on their computer, I'd encourage you, if you have the space available, to pull up beside this the 3395 regulation. And you can find that by typing into Google 3395 space DIR for Department of Industrial Relations, and that will often find you that regulation. You can follow along. The first requirement is access to water. They've found that water is the key preventative measure to preventing heat illness. Employers must provide potable drinking water to all employees at no cost to the employee, and that's key. Reimbursement is not a good option, and employees have to be provided it by their employer. You have to maintain at all times enough pure and cool potable drinking water, enough to provide at least 1 quart per employee per hour for their entire shift. So if that's an 8-hour shift, that ends up being 2 gallons of water. So if you can't provide them at the beginning with 2 gallons of water, you have to provide them with some method to refill. And I'll talk a little about how AC Transit did that a little later. The water must be fit to drink. We've seen a lot of gross water in our days in enforcement, and the water containers have to be clean, and they have to be refilled from potable drinking water sources. So you can't use irrigation wells, you can't use sprinklers, firefighting systems. You also don't want to use certain types of hoses if they aren't rated for drinking water. And then care must be taken to prevent contamination of drinking water that's supplied to the workers. So each worker should have their own container. If you're providing containers, they shouldn't have to share them. You also have to implement effective replenishment procedures when beginning the shift with smaller quantities. So again, if you have a mobile crew and you can't provide them with enough water at the beginning of their shift to last them the whole shift, how do you plan on providing them water? For AC Transit, they had a number of locations along the route where drivers or operators could fill up their water. So think about how you're doing that. The water has to be as close as practicable, giving the working conditions and layout of the work site. So it's going to depend on what type of workplace you have for where your water needs to be placed. It needs to be readily accessible. So if you have crews that are at different locations throughout the day, how are you going to provide it to those people at the different locations and make sure it's close by? If they're doing the same route over and over again in the same way, then you may be able to have a plan for that. But what if they are doing pickups at different locations throughout the day? You should have a separate plan for that. Again, focusing on how you're actually going to ensure that your employees have water. And as always, you're going to want to remind your workers to not wait until you're thirsty to start drinking. So especially on hot days, you need to encourage your employees to drink water frequently. So subsection D is on shade. The regulation says that all employers must provide shade upon request for outdoor workers. And when the temperature reaches 80 degrees, that shade has to be up and present. So again, that requirement, have and maintain 1 or more areas of shade at all times when employees are present. Similarly to the water, you're supposed to locate the shade as close as practical to where the employees are working. And access to shade must be permitted at all times. So let's say it's 70 degrees outside, an employee needs to cool down and they ask for shade. The employer has an obligation to provide them with access to shade. I recognize that can be difficult, especially for mobile crews. Employers are supposed to encourage employees to take a cool down rest period. And when they take those cool down rest periods, you're supposed to monitor the employees. So that can be done via cell phone, via if you've got supervisors that are in the field, maybe they want to go and check on them, to ask them if they're experiencing any symptoms of heat illness. This could be confusion, this could be sweating. In the more serious stages of heat illness, it would be actually not sweating, or cold or clammy skin. Don't order an employee back to work until symptoms have abated, and you want to allow at least 5 minutes for those employees to rest. If they do have some of the signs and symptoms of heat illness, you're going to want to take the appropriate first aid steps, or in severe cases, call for emergency response. The shaded area must not cause exposure to other health or safety hazards. So, for instance, if you have mobile equipment, you don't want to say, go park your truck in the shade and then go lie underneath your equipment, right? And there was a laugh here, but we've seen a lot of that, where you have the trucks in the field and that's the only shade, and so the employees go and they tuck themselves under the truck, or you have trees with really low branches and the employees are sort of crawling under the trees to get shade. We've seen a lot of improvement about access to shade, but you want to make sure that it's a place where employees are going to want to come and want to use that shade structure. Again, the purpose of the shade is to allow the employee to cool down and let their body temperature cool. So if the temperature is below 80 degrees, the shade needs to be provided timely upon request. How hot it feels depends on many conditions. Depends on what work you're doing, how humid it is, if there's a breeze or not. So no matter the temperature, the employer is obligated to provide timely access. Now, there are some cases where it's infeasible or unsafe to provide shade. And I enjoyed downloading these pictures. And it's a real thing. I know Caltrans can't put up shade tents on the side of the freeway. You've got wind that could come along, and the last thing you want is cars driving at 70 miles per hour into shade structures. So for those, there are some alternative measures that might be done to allow employees to cool down. So you might have them drive a short distance to a location with shade, or provide an air-conditioned vehicle, or provide misting machine. So there are a few options, but it is the obligation of the employer to show that classic shade structures are infeasible or unsafe before you can go to these alternative methods. So monitoring the weather, this is something that's, I think, changed in a real positive way since 2005. Almost everybody has an iPhone with them or some sort of smartphone. It's become really easy to check the temperature. We have a link here to the National Weather Service, but you can use Google. National Weather Service has a website, which I put at the bottom, called the Heat Risk website. And on the right is a little clip of the Heat Risk website. And I looked it up a few days ago, and you can see here that this map is for today, and you can see the areas where it's warm. And they've got 4 different colors that show the risk of heat illness. So they have, I think, a green, a yellow, an orange, and then I think it's a red and a magenta when it gets really bad. So this is a good way. You can look out a week. So maybe at the start of the week, you look at the weather, you see where it's going to be hot, and you can take effective measures to prevent heat illness in your employees. Now I'd like to cover high heat procedures. Now, I put in here what's actually the first part of 3395 regulation, which is the scope and application. And I didn't cover scope and application in definitions because I think it's pretty boring. It's, read it once, but and you can read that on your own. But the scope and application is important because it says here, there's a list of industries subject to all provisions of the standard, including subsection E. So if your industry is not listed here, then you don't have to follow subsection E, which is the high heat procedures. So the industries included are agriculture, construction, landscaping, oil and gas extraction. And then this last one, which is applicable to many on this call, is the transportation or delivery of agricultural, construction materials, or other heavy materials. The key here is that there are people that are having to move this material, which increases your heat load, which increases your risk of developing a heat illness. So in conversations with Kathy and Veronica, we said that my understanding is most people implement high heat procedures in this industry. And I think that's great, and I think that's what the standard requires. So when the temperature equals or exceeds 95 degrees, employers must implement additional preventative measures. The first one is you have to ensure effective communication with your employees. So think about how you're doing that with your people in the field. Do they have cell phones? Do they have cell phone receptions? Maybe they've got another system in place to communicate with their supervisors. You want a method to observe your employees for signs and symptoms of heat illness. And our standard lists a number of ways you can do that. The first is supervisory or designee can observe the employee. And that's good if you have 20 or fewer employees. You can have a mandatory buddy system. That's actually what Cal OSHA does. When we're out in the field and it's greater than 95 degrees, we send 2 inspectors out so they can observe each other. You have regular communication between employees and supervisors. And the regulation does say, or other effective means, which means you can do something as long as you can show that it's as effective as the 3 other types listed here. When the temperature exceeds 95 degrees, you're going to designate 1 or more employees to call for emergency services. There was a recent case law where an employer, when somebody would get sick, they would call into the office first, and they would say, "Hey, we got Joe here. He's sick. You know, he's showing these symptoms of heat illness." Then that person from the office would get a hold of the manager, and then the manager would do an assessment and decide whether or not to call emergency services. All that delay increases the chance of a more serious heat illness. And the appeals board for Cal OSHA said, you can't do that. You have to say that there's 1 person that can call emergency services, and you can't require employees to go through layers of management before doing that. And 3395 under the high heat procedure says, indeed, you need to designate 1 employee to call for EMS.
Can I ask a question on that? So the protocol then, if you're the supervisor and you've got someone that you think has symptoms of heat illness, what do you recommend? I mean, you don't take them to urgent care in the moment, right? Walk through what you recommend the steps be.
So your supervisors hopefully have been trained according to subsection H of our standard and know the signs and symptoms of heat illness. And they're going to respond very differently depending on what those signs are. So let's say an employee is a little lightheaded or is very thirsty or feels weak. It may be enough to just have some first aid where they go in a cool spot, they go in their shade that's provided, they're given some water. A good first aid method is you can put packs of ice under their armpits or their groins to cool them down. But let's say some of the more severe symptoms, like let's say the person doesn't know where they are, they've got a lot of mental confusion, or they're vomiting, right? So if someone's vomiting, that's a more severe heat illness, and you're going to want to call EMS right away. So the key really is employees need to know the signs and symptoms themselves. So when they start to feel it, they're going to be the ones that know their body the best, right? That they recognize it, that they can take those initial measures so that it doesn't develop to a more serious heat illness. And then supervisors are going to also recognize the signs and symptoms. So you have those employees and they want to work hard, or they want to finish their shift, and they want to keep going and keep going. And that's where a supervisor comes in and says, you know, you need to take a cool down rest period. And especially during high heat, it's really on the supervisors to encourage those employees to take more frequent breaks. So here, there is a requirement in our regulation that you need to give employees more frequent reminders to drink water, and you also need to hold pre-shift meetings on prevention. So those could be a quick couple-minute talk at the beginning of the shift before people go in the fields or before they get their trucks to say, look, it's going to be 98 out today. I want everybody to be doing X, Y, Z to make sure they're safe. Oh, and I think we may have the sounds queued up here. So why don't we try again? We're going to try with AC Transit.
1 on the 88, I'm too hot. I'm going to have to take a break at the top at center and shout it. Can't drive the bus like this anymore.
Hey, are you giving me a status? Are you going sick? What's going on?
I got to get out of the bus and cool off somehow. There's sweat pouring down my eyes. I can't see. I'm sitting up here roasting. I'm getting where I can't even think straight.
Hey, that's a copy. Do you need me to send you medical or anything? That's what I'm asking you. Are you okay? You need us to send you some help?
So what would you do? I want everyone on this call to think, if you got that call or your supervisor got that call, what would you do? What steps would you take? Now, I'm going to play another clip, and this is, I ended up getting actually 7 clips that are just like this. And there's a couple right in the beginning, then 15 minutes later, there's a couple of these, and then again, 15 minutes later, there's more of these calls in. Can you play that?
1 on the 88, 1 on the 88.
So it's just that over and over again. You've got the command center that's calling them to try to reach this bus driver, this bus operator, and cannot. So think about what you would do. What emergency response procedures would you have in place if you had an employee that called and said, it's getting to where I can't even think straight. I just got to get off this bus. Okay, you've got people in the field, they're working, they're hauling heavy loads. It's 100 degrees outside. They're starting to get the symptoms of heat illness. What are you going to do to address it? And that's where subsection F comes in, emergency response procedures. You need to ensure effective communication between employees and their supervisors to ensure that supervisors know about those signs and symptoms of heat illness. You're supposed to respond to them, so the supervisor needs to take immediate and appropriate action. So as we discussed a second ago, appropriate action really depends on what the symptoms are, what the situation is, where they are, if they can find a place to cool down or not. There's going to be a lot of variables, and you are going to want to spell out some of those situations and what to do in the different situations. If the indicators are of a serious heat illness, you want to implement your emergency response procedures. I want to talk next about acclimatization. Now, this chart here is from a study of 25 of these 2005 cases that CalOSHA investigate. 16 of these employees died. And you'll note this is the number of days they were on the job. A staggering 46% of these employees, so that's 12 out of the 25, were on their first day at their job. And if you go out to 4 days and you add those up, that's 80% of these employees were in the first 4 days of their job. And that trend has continued throughout the years. We've, luckily, the last few years, we've only had 1 heat illness death in California, down from this really high number in 2005. But we continue to see that many of the heat illnesses, we had 77 confirmed heat illnesses that we investigated last year. And acclimatization continues to be a huge factor. And you'll note this is at the top here, the bullet point is, it's 3395B, which is that definition section, which I said you can read on your own. It defines what acclimatization is. And it says acclimatization peaks in most people within 4 to 14 days of regular work. And I think that 4 lines up really well with what you see here, which is that people are getting sick in the first 4 days of work, those unacclimatized individuals. As an employer, you need to address acclimatization. You're responsible for putting in place some procedures for those unacclimatized individuals, including closely observing them for the first 14 days of employment. Again, during those first 14 days, employees are going to be at a much higher risk. I've heard one method, like construction crews will actually give red bandanas to their employees for the first 14 days to identify them so that the other employees can watch out for them, supervisors can identify them. Some ideas for addressing acclimatization would be to lessen the intensity or the shift length of a newly hired employee during their the first 2 weeks. So maybe shift their schedule to make it a little earlier in the morning when the heat's not going to be quite as bad. And then be extra vigilant with your employees to, again, recognize those symptoms of heat illness early. One issue you have is you do have employees, when they get a new job, guess what? They want to work really hard and really show you how tough they are and show you how they can work through their need for water or their rest breaks or their stops. So it's really going to be up for the supervisors and management to make sure that those employees take the breaks, cool themselves down, and don't develop a heat illness. Subsection H is on supervisory training. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I think H does a great job in the regulation of explaining the different components of it. Your employees need to be trained before beginning work that should reasonably be anticipated to result in a heat illness. Now, you know, your guess is as good as mine as exactly what that means. Does it mean in January or February or March? You have to think about when your employees are going to be exposed to the risk of heat illness. The regulation doesn't require annual training, but I think it's a really good idea to consider annual refresher training for all of your employees at the beginning of heat season or whatever you consider heat season to be. You're going to train employees on the environmental and personal risk factors of heat illness, as well as the added burden of heat load on the body. So think of workers with alcohol or drug abuse problems are at increased risk, as are workers that have on certain types of heart medications that might be diuretics, meaning they don't hold their water quite as well. And these are things that you likely are not going to be able to know about your employees or ask about your employees. So you want to make them aware, you want to train them on these so that they know themselves. You're going to train them on your company's heat illness prevention procedures. So you're going to train them on what you are doing as a company to ensure they get the water, the shade, the cool down rests, and access to first aid. You need to tell your employees how you plan to keep them safe. What should they do if their air conditioning breaks? And we had a heat illness case last year where an employee was in a cab of a front loader and the AC broke. And he said, I just wanted to finish my job. I just had a little left. And it only took him according to him, about 30 minutes of him in that cab with the broken AC for him to develop a heat illness that sent him to the hospital for over 24 hours. So you're going to want to have procedures, again, for your employees. If they're out there and it's hot, their AC breaks, what should they do? What should workers do if they run out of water while en route? Or what should they do if they start to feel sick? Do they need to finish their route? Can they call a supervisor? Is there a plan in place for that? Remind your employees about the importance of frequent consumption of small quantities of water. You're going to tell them about the different types of heat illness, the common signs and symptoms. We talked about that before, that they really need to be able to recognize in themselves what those signs and symptoms are so that they can start to take the preventative measures. You need to train them on the concept, importance, and method of acclimatization. Now, acclimatization was one of the changes that was made to the regulation from when it first came out. And in that initial study of the 25 heat illnesses and the 16 deaths, they asked the employees if they knew about acclimatization. And 100% of those illnesses, they did not teach about acclimatization and how your body does adapt and make physiological changes to the heat. So it's important to train employees about that. You need to train them on the importance of reporting signs and symptoms of heat illness as early as possible so that you know about it and you can address them. What procedures the employees need to follow, such as contacting EMS and when to do so. And for those that have remote work sites, this is especially for ag, you may have some remote work sites where people are out in the field doing a pickup they haven't done before. If someone gets sick, you want them to be able to when they call EMS, to give them directions to where they're at. So if you know you're going to have people that are going to be maybe off in the foothills or in areas they haven't been before, you should consider how they're going to be able to provide directions to EMS. There's a little bit of additional training that's required for supervisors. Supervisors, of course, have to get all the training topics that I just went over. Then what procedures they have to follow to implement all the requirements of the standard. They have to have training on the procedures they're going to follow when a worker or one of their employees exhibits any of the signs or symptoms of heat illness. And last, as I discussed earlier, the monitoring of the weather. So talk to them about how they're going to monitor the weather reports. Maybe put a plan in place for them to monitor. The last subsection of 3395 is written procedures. And these have changed a lot and I think are a lot clearer as the regulation's been updated. Your procedures can be standalone, which is what I see most employers have, although you can put it as part of your injury and illness prevention program. There is a requirement to maintain the procedures on site or close to the site to be made available upon request by Cal OSHA or employees. Now, in our FAQ section online, it does say that they can be available electronically, so as long as they're accessible. So if a Cal OSHA inspector comes on site and says, hey, I want to take a look at your heat illness prevention program, it doesn't need to be in the truck, but the person needs to be able to find it, maybe pull it up on their phone or get it emailed to them so that they can see it. Your written program is going to detail how you're meeting all the different sections of the regulation. So that's how you're providing access to water, to shade, how you're monitoring the weather, how you're implementing those high heat procedures for when it's greater than 95, how you will address acclimatization, both in the training and for those new employees. And again, I want to remind you that 80% of those illnesses back in 2005, all of those employees were not acclimatized because it was their first day in the field. So that's a really important thing to have in your written procedure. That is a change in the regulation. A couple reminder slides here. You do risk a serious citation if the outdoor temperature is above 80 degrees and you don't have drinking water for your employees, you don't have shade, your employees or your supervisors aren't trained, or you don't have emergency response procedures in place. And occasionally, we issued only one last year, but occasionally Cal OSHA does issue OPUs, or order prohibiting uses, which are where we shut down an operation. I think last year there was some agricultural work in the Delta picking blueberries, where it was a particularly hot March. We found that the employees didn't have any training, didn't have any water, didn't have any shade, and it was hot outside, and so we shut down the operation. So now I want to talk in my last 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, a little about AC Transit. So for AC Transit, we talked about these Van Hool buses, and back in 2007, we cited AC Transit for not under 3395, for not supplying water, not providing shade to the employee, and not having a written program. So the employer appeals the case. They say, Cal OSHA, we don't think these citations are right. We don't think that the regulation applies. We don't think that we are outdoor workers. So they say, outdoor place of employment does not equal the interior of buses. So an administrative law judge, 2 years later in 2009, agreed. They said, the division has not established that the term outdoor places of employment applies, and it means only workplaces that are outside of the building. The safety order's reasonably ascertainable meaning is that its application is limited to outdoor places of employment, which do not include the interiors of municipal transit buses. We didn't like that decision. Cal OSHA says, no, that's not when we drafted this regulation, that's not what we meant. So Cal OSHA then said about that ALJ decision, said, we want to appeal that. We don't think that's right. And then it goes to the appeals board, the Cal OSHA appeals board, and they issue what's called the decision after reconsideration. And they state, we find that the interior of a transit bus is not an outdoor place of employment. So Cal OSHA loses again. So is all lost? We're up to 2013 now with this decision. So Cal OSHA appeals that decision. And they appeal it with a petition for writ of mandate with the Alameda County Superior Court. And in 2014, the judge granted our petition for writ of mandate, reversing the appeals board's decision after reconsideration, saying the term outdoor is properly defined as out of doors or not in a building, which for everyone on this call means it is applicable to much of your workforce that are in vehicles. Currently, this ruling stands, but both the appeals board and AC Transit have appealed the court's decision.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the meantime, so 2014 was when we got our latest ruling, but we didn't like the fact that AC Transit was not providing water, was not providing restrooms to these bus drivers. And they'd have maybe routes that might be an hour and a half long, and then if they got stuck in traffic or there's a problem and they were late, then they wouldn't have time for the break, and they'd go back and they wouldn't have an opportunity to use the restroom or fill up their water. So Cal OSHA cited AC Transit back in 2009 again for not providing water to the employees under the general industry safety orders of 3363. Say, look, every employer has an obligation to provide water. Maybe you aren't an outdoor workplace and 3395 applies, but you're still a workplace. And in that, the administrative law judge agreed. They said, yeah, you are a workplace. You do need to provide water to your employees. They also said that the employer needs to reimburse the drivers for water purchases or supply them with water bottles and water containers on the buses. AC Transit appealed that, but the appeals board agreed with the citations and the requirement that AC Transit provide water. So what do they do now? I have to say AC Transit, I give them credit. They have really gone out of their way and implemented a good heat illness prevention program. They still have some issues. They still have a number of these Van Hool buses that don't have air conditioning. They're working on retrofitting them, but they have gotten a good written program in place. They provide all bus operators with water bottles, and the operators can either use their own water bottles or the ones that the company provides. When they're going out into the field, the gate attendant verifies that they have their water bottle with them. They've routed their air-conditioned buses to be on the hotter routes so that the non-AC buses can go on the routes that aren't quite as hot. Then the operators are given a list of locations where they can get water and use the restroom. And AC Transit actually has contracts with these stores. I think they pay them a couple $100s, and they say, look, we recognize that our bus drivers aren't your customers, but we'd like them to be able to come in and fill up their water and use their restroom. And so they have these tiny contracts, and it provides them. Yeah, and the point is any Starbucks location too, apparently. And more recently, they've installed temperature gauges on the inside of their non-air conditioned buses, and they have procedures in place. So once it reaches 80 degrees in that bus, and 80 degrees is a pretty hot work environment, that they're supposed to call in headquarters, and then once it gets to 84 degrees, that they're supposed to stop operating the bus. And then training on this has been provided to all bus operators. So you may be wondering what has happened to this operator. So I'm going to play you the last clip of this song.
One on the 88. I think I'm going to be all right. I cool myself down. And I only have to make it till 5:30 at 40th Market. Then I get a little break after that. It'll cool off. Thank you. I'll be there.
So good news. He was okay. But this was half an hour after that initial tape. So again, think about what you would do. So if anyone has questions, they can go ahead and email them in. I'm going to just give a few slides, and then we'll open it up to additional questions. And I think, if I'm correct, a copy of these slides will go out to,
Yes.
to every member of this call. So you can click here. This is Cal OSHA's heat illness webpage. A lot of great resources there. It's got our enforcement Q&A documents. It's got some sample programs. Heat at dir.ca.gov is at the bottom. You can reach me via that or my email at the end. We have consultation. Again, employers can request consultation to help them with their programs and help make a safe workplace for their employees. There are some phone numbers there. We have a lot of great heat illness materials. There's been a whole campaign in California, and if you go to rural parts of the Central Valley, you may still see these. We've just budgeted another year of having these on the side of food trucks and small grocery stores. A really great campaign. This material is also available for educating your own staff. You can go on the 99color.org website. There's a link for employers. And those materials, we've got boxes of those materials within Cal OSHA, and we'll mail them to you free. So you can go on that website, let me know what materials you want. You can email me, and we will mail you the materials so you can give out to your employees. And thank you. And here is my contact information. That's my cell phone and my email. If anybody has any questions following up, you can route them either through the moderators or directly to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. That was incredibly informative. And just a final note, if you do have questions, please email them to veronica@crrcnorth.org. And thank you to those of you who have already sent in your questions. Kathy's going to be posing some of those questions now.
So thank you, David. That's very helpful. First of all, a question. If a driver has air conditioning in their truck, does the outdoor shade and the water apply, or if they have air conditioning in their vehicle?
So the point of the regulation is to prevent heat illness. Mm-hmm. And we always need to think back of the goal again is to make sure that workers are safe. I would say yes, the regulation does apply because it is often an outdoor place of employment. The AC Transit case, which again we talked about, in those it was a non-AC vehicle.
Right.
There was a case recently where employees were truck drivers, and they occasionally went out to check their tire pressure or to make sure they were hitched up all right. And the board said that is not an outdoor, that 3395 does not apply. That's not an outdoor place of employment. So I'm going to give you the answer of it depends. But the appeals board has said that if it's a truck and they're inside AC all the time, then maybe it doesn't. But again, it does depend on how much of the work outside. There's another case, Coca-Cola, where the employees go and they drive their trucks around. They're air conditioned inside, but then they distribute Coca-Cola to the Safeways and the grocery stores. The appeals board said that is outdoor employment. 3395 does apply because of the amount of time they spend out there outside their truck.
Well, that I think is a question that's emerging in the indoor heat standard, is particularly around drivers and whether they're indoor or outdoor when their work takes them inside and outside. So I'm hoping that something will get clarified. Another question, do all employees during working hours need to have a copy of the heat illness plan?
The heat illness plan needs to be available to employees upon request.
Okay.
So no, they don't need a copy on them, but they need access to it. So if they need to be able to either access it via their phone or be able to ask their supervisor for a copy and see it shortly. How often during enforcement inspections, we see it being enforced is if a Cal OSHA inspector goes out there and they don't have one on site, they say, before I leave today and finish my inspection, I want to be able to see a copy of it. And if the employer cannot produce in that time period a copy of the regulation, you got to think that it's probably going to be hard for the employees to get a copy during that time. And then Cal OSHA will issue a citation to the employer.
Okay. Probably a good way to handle that is in their heat illness prevention plan when they're doing their training, is to have employees know where that's kept.
Yeah, and you can say in your written plan, how you're distributing it and how people can get access.
How they can get access.
That's a great point, Kat.
Okay. Another question. Actually, this is a question I had. Just what types of violations do you notice most frequently, just in the work that you've done over a period of time? And what recommendations, just simple recommendations, you've given a lot of good advice here, would you have?
Yeah, so last year enforcement in 2017 issued $4.4 million in citations. Wow. Just on 3395. And the most frequently citations, there were about 6,000 citations that were issued last year for 3395. The vast majority of those citations are employers not having a written program. Mm-hmm. You go to a work site, you say, hey, you have work that's outdoors, you need a written heat illness prevention program. And so it's employers simply not having it. The second most frequently cited one is on training for the employee. So a recent court case said actually that the regulation doesn't require I should be specific, 3395 regulation does not require the employer to maintain records of heat illness training. I encourage all employers, if you're going to take the time to give the training, take the time to document the training. But the second most cited is not failure to provide training. And we did see a case where only one employee on the crew was not trained. It was a new employee, and Cal OSHA cited for it, and the appeals board upheld it. They said, every employee, 95% does not cut it. If employees are out and they're working outdoors or exposed to heat, they need the training.
And it sounds like since you don't have to provide training on an annual basis, so you're highly recommending that, and then document that you've done the training on this shift, or
Cal OSHA
keep a record.
Just I think maybe 2 months ago, I gave the training to all our Cal OSHA inspectors. Again, we do an annual refresher training. I think it's good. People have a cold winter; they don't think about the heat. In the very beginning of that heat, those first heat waves, that's where you'll see a lot of illnesses because, again, people are not acclimatized to that. So we encourage employers to provide that refresher training to employees, just to remind them of what procedures they have in place to protect their employees, know that they're being taken care of.
And if you were to hire a new employee during that time period as well, you would need to provide that training to that individual employee.
Correct. Yeah. The employees need to be trained before they have a risk of heat illness.
Right. I think the most interesting thing that I learned today was about the training of monitoring employees that are brand new to the workplace, to really have almost a plan in place for new hires for the first couple weeks.
Yeah, sadly, we've seen a lot of the deaths over the last 10 years are people that are on their maybe first or second day of the job, and they're out there, they're working hard, but they haven't been trained, they don't recognize the signs and symptoms, they start to get heat illness, and from those initial symptoms of heat illness, it can progress to very serious illness very quickly. It's really important to get emergency services.
I think we're good.
Well, David, thank you. Again, this has been very informative. And for those on the webinar, we will be posting this presentation to our YouTube website. So we'd like to thank David Hornung for all of his information today, and you do have his contact information. And if you have any additional questions for me or Kathy, feel free to email us directly. And again, we just want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.